Good evening, and welcome to News of the World. It's Sunday, July 12th. Tonight, we drift slowly across 28 countries from Czechia to Finland. There's nothing you need to do and nowhere you need to be. Settle in and let the world turn. Czechia is quietly working on something that doesn't always make the loudest headlines, but matters deeply to the people who will feel it. The country is preparing an initiative called Barrier-Free Czechia 2026, aimed at opening up its historic cities and nature destinations to visitors who've long found them difficult or even impossible to reach. If you've ever wandered through a medieval old town, you know the charm. Cobblestones, narrow alleys, centuries-old bridges. Beautiful, yes. But for someone using a wheelchair, or pushing a stroller, or simply aging into a body that doesn't move the way it once did, those same streets can become walls. The initiative is meant to change that, to think about access not as an afterthought, but as something woven into the experience of visiting a place. And Czechia has a lot to offer. Town squares that have stood for hundreds of years, forest trails, river valleys, spa towns tucked into quiet hills. The vision behind Barrier-Free Czechia 2026 seems to be that none of these should belong only to the able-bodied. Setting a target like 2026 gives the work a shape, a horizon. It suggests this isn't just a promise, but a plan with an end in sight. For a country whose beauty has always been tied to its age, there's something hopeful about making sure that beauty is something more people can actually reach. Perhaps that's the quietest kind of progress, the kind that simply opens a door. In Micronesia, in the state of Chuuk, help has been arriving from an old Pacific neighbor. Japan is extending aid to support education and health, along with other community needs across the islands. Chuuk sits within a vast lagoon, one of the largest in the world, where scattered islands rise from turquoise water and where daily life has always moved at the pace of the tides. The relationship between Japan and these islands reaches back generations through periods of administration and trade and the quieter exchanges that happen between near neighbors across the sea. Aid like this tends to arrive not as a single dramatic gesture, but as steady support, the kind that shows up in classrooms and clinics and settles into the background of daily life, making things work a little better. For families in Chuuk, that kind of consistency matters. The Pacific can feel vast, and distances between islands can feel even vaster. So when a partner stays close and keeps showing up, it carries its own quiet weight. If you're still with me, picture those lagoon waters going silver in the late light, and the sound of children somewhere heading home from a school that someone thought to invest in. The world keeps turning, and the small acts of partnership, the ones that don't make headlines far away, are often the ones that hold things together night after night. In Togo, a regional program has been officially launched to support the pastoral economy across West Africa and the Sahel. The initiative, known as PRADPREP AOS, is backed by the Food and Agriculture Organization and reaches across a part of the world where herding has shaped life for centuries, across borders, across seasons, across generations. Pastoralism in this region isn't a relic, it's a living economy, one that feeds communities and sustains rural livelihoods, and it threads through countries that share grazing lands, trade routes, and a dependence on rains that don't always come when expected. What the launch signals most simply is a collective recognition that these communities deserve coordinated support, that their challenges don't stop at national boundaries, and neither should the response. For Togo, sitting along the Gulf of Guinea but reaching north into terrain where cattle move and grazing matters, the program connects local realities to a wider regional effort. The details of what PRADPEP AOS will fund and how it will operate on the ground will unfold in the months ahead. But the intention is clear, and it's worth noting. A region choosing to invest in the people who move with their herds, who carry knowledge older than any map drawn around these nations. If you're still with me, it's the kind of story that doesn't shout, But some nights, the quiet ones are worth holding on to. Paraguay's World Cup summer brought the country onto football's biggest stage, a win over Turkey, a hard-fought match against France that came down to a single goal. Manager Gustavo Alfaro spoke afterward with real pride in his players, though he admitted he couldn't be objective about the penalty that decided things. There was debate, too, about Paraguay's tactics, some calling them too rough, others saying they were simply the best way to compete against a stronger side. That's sport. That's the game. But after the final whistle, something else surfaced. A Paraguayan senator, Celeste Amarilla, made racist remarks about French star Kylian Mbappé on social media. Mbappé condemned the remarks publicly. Amarilla later claimed her Instagram had been hacked. Whether people believe that or not, the words had already been said, and they traveled well beyond Paraguay's borders. It's the kind of moment that sits heavier than any result. A country fights its way onto the world stage, plays with heart, and then one voice says something that doesn't represent the team, or the manager, or the fans who cheered them through. Paraguay, like every nation at this tournament, is more than its worst comment. And maybe that's what's worth holding tonight. Not the ugliness, but the pride that came before it, and the quiet sense that it will outlast this. Ukraine these days is a country pressing forward, even as the cost keeps coming. Russian missiles and drones have again struck Ukrainian communities. 2 people killed, 19 wounded in one barrage, and other attacks have taken lives as well. The numbers are small words for something that isn't small at all. But something in the shape of this war is shifting. Ukrainian forces have struck deep, hitting a Russian military training ground, disrupting a drone command network, targeting oil tankers that fuel the war machine. There's a blockade tightening around Russian-occupied Crimea, where the lights and the gas and the communications have begun to fail. The question being asked now, quietly and not so quietly, is whether Ukraine might cut the land bridge that connects Crimea to the Russian mainland. Behind it all, somewhere in a factory no one is meant to find, Ukrainians are building the drones that make these strikes possible, their own hands, their own ingenuity, in a war that has demanded both. And yet, the war may be turning against Putin, but he is not giving in. That is the harder truth underneath these days. The tide moves, but it does not move fast, and people are still living in the space between where this war is and where it might end. Libya has lived with division for years now. Rival administrations holding different parts of a country that should be whole. This week, a quietly unexpected development has entered the picture. Pakistan, far to the east, has been mediating between Libya's rival camps, working to help them find common ground. Pakistani sources describe the effort as backed by the United States, with the aim of bringing competing factions toward a deal. It might seem an unlikely pairing at first glance. Pakistan has no deep historical footprint in North Africa. But diplomacy sometimes arrives from directions you don't expect, and the fact that Libyan factions are willing to entertain mediation at all suggests something. Perhaps weariness, perhaps a genuine opening, perhaps simply the recognition that stalemate serves no one. What a unity agreement might actually look like remains unclear, and the distance between mediation and settlement is long in any country. But for Libya, where the ordinary business of governance has been tangled by division, the presence of a conversation is worth noting. In towns and cities across the country, people carry on hoping, as people everywhere do, for steadier ground beneath them. Somewhere tonight, in rooms most of us will never see, people are talking, and sometimes that's where the hardest things begin, quietly to move. Palau sits out in the Western Pacific, a scatter of islands with fewer than 20,000 people. And these days, its voice carries further than you might expect. The president of Palau has called for diplomatic condemnation of a Chinese missile test, joining other Pacific Island nations in pushing back against military activity in the waters they call the Blue Continent. For Palau, this is not abstract. The ocean is the country. It is the territory between the islands, the fishing grounds, the reefs, the place where daily life happens. When a missile falls into that ocean, it lands on something sacred. Palau is one of the 12 countries that still maintain formal diplomatic ties with Taiwan, a choice that places it squarely in the tension between Washington and Beijing. That position is not comfortable for a small nation, but it has been consistent. The president's call for condemnation is a reminder that the Pacific is not empty space where great powers can test weapons in silence. People live here, children learn to read by looking at the sea, fishermen go out before dawn. The Blue Continent has its own citizens, and they are speaking up. If you are still with me, hold that thought. A small country asking the world to notice what falls into its waters is not a small thing. It is a quiet act of dignity, and it deserves to be heard before we drift on. Japan has long been a country that looks upward, not just in habit and ceremony, but in the quiet, patient way it reaches for the sky. This week, that reach took another step. Japan's space agency carried out the first test flight of an experimental reusable rocket, the kind of vehicle designed to fly more than once, to come back down, be readied, and go again. It's a small thing, perhaps, in an era when rockets have become almost routine elsewhere. But for Japan, it's a deliberate move toward a future where space access is lighter on resources and gentler on the wallet. Details from the flight itself are still scarce. How high it climbed, how cleanly it returned. But the fact that it happened at all marks a beginning rather than a conclusion. Reusable rockets are, in their way, an argument against waste. You build something carefully, you send it up, and then instead of letting it fall away into the sea, you bring it home. There's something deeply Japanese in that logic, the idea that a thing well made should be used again, not discarded. If you're still with me, picture a quiet morning at a coastal launch site. Engineers who've spent months on this moment watching a slender shape lift off the pad, knowing that what goes up must, this time, also come back down in one piece. Whatever the data shows, that first flight is already a kind of success. A door opened. And somewhere beyond it, the next one waits. St. Vincent and the Grenadines is a string of islands where farming has always mattered. Banana growers, root crop farmers, people who turn what they grow into something shelf-ready. These days, that work is getting a quiet lift. The Inter-American Institute for Cooperation on Agriculture, known as IICA, has been working with agro-processors here to help them meet export standards. That sounds technical, and in some ways it is. But what it really means is that people who make jams, sauces, dried fruits, ground provisions packaged for sale, they're getting the tools and the know-how to sell beyond their own shores and to do it well. If you've traveled through the Caribbean, you may have tasted something from these islands without knowing it, a bottle of hot sauce, a jar of fruit preserves, the kind of thing that carries a place with it. Export standards are the gate you pass through to reach shelves in other countries, and they can be exacting. Labeling, safety, consistency, packaging that holds up over distance. For a small producer, navigating all of that alone is hard. So IICA steps in, not with fanfare, but with training, with guidance, with the kind of practical help that turns a good product into one that travels. What stays with me is the steadiness of it. No grand announcement, just people who grow and make things, learning to carry those things a little further. And somewhere out there, a kitchen table that will hold a piece of St. Vincent before long. Kiribati sits out in the central Pacific, a scatter of 33 islands stretched across the equator. And these days it is marking 47 years as an independent nation. That is not a long time in the grand sweep of things, but out here, where the ocean is wider than most maps can really show. Every year held is a year earned. The National Day falls on July 12th, and you can imagine the gatherings, families together, songs and Gilbertays, the quiet pride of a country that has spent its whole existence negotiating the space between what the world assumes about it and what it actually knows to be true. There has been a phrase going around lately from voices in the community: we are more than a vulnerable island, and that is worth sitting with. Kiribati does face rising seas, and that story is real, but it is not the whole story. There's also this: on a remote island somewhere in the chain, more than 1,000 people now have clean water and electricity, powered by solar systems they run themselves, not handed down from elsewhere, operated by the community. That is independence too, in its most practical form. And if you have ever spent time among Kiribati people, you might know the quality of welcome that comes naturally there, where strangers arrive and somehow leave as friends. 47 years on, Kiribati is still writing its own account of itself, not as a footnote to someone else's worry, but as a nation with its own rhythm, its own language, its own sense of what matters. Tonight, that is the story worth carrying. Nauru sits out in the Pacific like a single bright coin on a wide, dark table. 8 square miles of coral rock and phosphate plateau, one of the smallest sovereign nations on Earth. For a long time, its story was told by others as a footnote in larger powers' calculations or as a cautionary tale of resource wealth spent too quickly. These days, something quieter and more deliberate is happening on the island. The United Nations Development Program is working with Nauru's government on what it calls building the foundations for the country's next chapter, a phrase that, stripped of its bureaucratic wrapping, points at something real. Nauru has been here far longer than the phosphate trade that reshaped it, and it will be here long after that trade is gone. What does it mean to plan for a future when your land is small, your fresh water is scarce, and the ocean around you is rising? It means thinking carefully. It means deciding what stays and what changes, and doing that work on your own terms, with partners who respect that the decisions belong to Nauruans. The details of the program are still taking shape, but the direction is clear enough. Not a rescue, not a grand transformation, just the steady, patient work of putting one stone on another so that whatever comes next rests on solid ground. Out there on the equatorial Pacific, the trade winds carry the same salt smell they always have, and the people of Nauru are looking ahead, not with urgency, but with the quiet conviction that their island, small as it is, has a future worth building carefully. Serbia sits at a familiar crossroads these days, and not just the geographic one. The country has been quietly upgrading its air force, fitting its MiG-29 SM fighter jets with a new supersonic strike missile, China's CM-400 AKG. It's a fast, long-range weapon designed to hit ground targets, and its arrival in Serbia's arsenal marks something of a shift in how this small, non-aligned Balkan state thinks about its own defense. Serbia has long walked a careful line. It's not a NATO member, though it sits surrounded by NATO countries. It has historic ties to Russia, growing economic links with China, and a steady aspiration toward European Union membership. So every military decision Belgrade makes is read closely by its neighbors and by the wider alliance. These MiG-29s are older airframes, Soviet in origin, kept flying through years of careful maintenance and a few donated airframes from Russia. What's new is the missile underneath the wing, a weapon that travels faster than sound and reaches farther than anything Serbia has fielded before. The details remain limited, and it's unclear how many of these missiles have arrived or when they'll be fully operational. But the signal is plain enough. Belgrade wants its small air force to matter, to hold weight beyond its size. Whether that changes the balance in any real sense, or simply adds a new thread to an already complicated region, is something the coming months will show. For now, Serbia tends its fleet and watches the sky the way it always has, carefully. Ecuador holds a quiet secret that most of the world overlooks. We tend to believe Mount Everest, rising above the Himalayas, is the highest point on Earth, the closest a person can stand to outer space. But that depends on how you measure. If you measure from the center of the planet outward, the crown goes not to Everest but to a volcano in Ecuador called Chimborazo. Chimborazo sits just 1 degree south of the equator, and that matters more than you might think. Our planet isn't a perfect sphere. It bulges slightly around the middle, where the equator spins, pushed outward by the slow rotation of the whole world over billions of years. Because Chimborazo stands on that bulge, its summit reaches over 2,100 meters farther from the center of the Earth than Everest's peak does. Think about that for a moment. A mountain in a small Andean nation, one that many people couldn't point to on a map, actually tops the one we've all been taught to revere. Chimborazo is an extinct volcano, snow-capped and massive, and it rises above the central highlands of Ecuador, where the air thins and the condors circle. Climbers who make the summit aren't standing on the tallest mountain measured from sea level, but they are, in a very real sense, the closest human beings can get to the stars while keeping both feet on the ground. There's something gentle and wonderful about that correction, the way the Earth, just by being itself, shifts the story away from the famous and toward the overlooked. Goodnight. In Ghana, these are the days of clearing away water and counting what the rains have taken. Floods have moved through communities there, and people are left to clean up in the aftermath, pulling mud from doorways, drying what can be dried, gathering again in places that were suddenly not safe. The word from the headlines is deadly, and that word carries real weight. Lives were lost. Homes and streets that people knew well became something else entirely for a few terrible hours. What follows now is slower and quieter than the disaster itself. Neighbors help neighbors. Tools come out. The work is physical and repetitive and necessary, and it does not make the news the way the floodwaters did. Ghana knows this rhythm, as many West African nations do. The rains come hard in their season, and drainage systems built for a different era strain under what falls now. Each time, people rebuild. Each time, there are conversations about what might be done differently before the next season arrives. If you're still with me, hold that thought. Not the flood at its worst, but the morning after, when someone sweeps a front step and a neighbor brings water and the street begins to look like a street again. That is where Ghana is tonight. The water has done what it came to do. The people who remain are doing what people do. In Vatican City, the smallest independent state in the world, a voice has gone out this week that reaches far beyond its ancient walls. The Holy See has called for no one to be left behind in the care and prevention of AIDS. It is the kind of statement that might pass quickly through a news cycle, but it carries a particular weight when you consider where it comes from. This is a place that speaks to over 1 billion Catholics across every continent, and its words on health tend to be measured, deliberate, and aimed at the most vulnerable. The message is simple, really. Care should reach everyone. Prevention should reach everyone. No one should be forgotten at the margins. That means people in remote villages, in overcrowded cities, in places where medicine is scarce and stigma is not. The Holy See did not arrive at this concern overnight. For decades, Catholic institutions have run clinics and hospices in some of the poorest corners of the world, places where the fight against AIDS is not abstract, but daily and exhausting. So when Vatican City speaks about leaving no one behind, it is speaking from experience as much as from conviction. And if you are still with me, you might notice how quiet this place is at night. The lights dim along the colonnade. The crowds thin, and what remains is a very small city with a very long reach, saying something that matters to people it will never meet. That, perhaps, is the story worth carrying into the dark. Trinidad and Tobago sits at the southern edge of the Caribbean, two islands that share one government and a legal system still tied, in its highest appeals, to London. This week, that connection matters in a particular way. An English court is set to rule on what may be the final challenge to Trinidad and Tobago's ban on gay sex, a law that dates back to colonial times and has survived decades of argument, protest, and quiet endurance. The Privy Council in London serves as the final court of appeal for Trinidad and Tobago, which means this ruling carries real weight. It can't be appealed further. For years, activists in Port of Spain and beyond have pushed to have the law struck down, arguing that it criminalizes intimacy and dignity in equal measure. Courts within Trinidad have gone back and forth, and now the question rests with judges an ocean away, a reminder of how long colonial threads can hold even long after independence. If the court rules against the ban, it would mark a turning point for LGBTQ people across the Twin Islands who have lived under the shadow of this law for generations. If it doesn't, the fight returns home, unchanged but not ended. Either way, someone is waiting, has been waiting a long time, for a door to open or to stay shut. And on a warm night in the Caribbean, that waiting continues, steady as the trade winds that have always blown through these islands. Rwanda has a way of gathering people back together, and lately that gathering has been happening on a football pitch. Across the country, amputee football players have been finding something more than sport, a sense of community, and with it, a kind of healing. The details are simple. Men and women who have lost limbs, many of them survivors of accidents or illness, some carrying older wounds, pull on jerseys and play the game they love. They move on crutches, on prosthetics, with the determined grace that comes when someone refuses to be defined by what they've lost. Football demands teamwork, and that might be the real medicine here. You pass to someone, you trust them, you are trusted in return. For players who have known isolation or long recovery, that exchange can rebuild something quiet but essential, the feeling of belonging to something larger than yourself. Rwanda knows something about rebuilding. The country has spent decades doing that work in many forms, and these footballers are part of that longer story, even if they'd never described themselves that way. They're just playing, running where they can, passing when they should, celebrating the goals that come. And when the match ends, there's the handshake line, the laughter, the slow walk off the pitch together. If you're still with me, picture that walk. Not the score, not the spectacle, just a group of people tired and happy, heading home in the evening light, carrying something lighter than when they arrived. Comoros is a small place to come from if you're a footballer with your eyes on the world. 4 islands in the Indian Ocean, off the northern end of Madagascar, fewer than 1 million people, and a deep love of the game that far outstrips the country's size. These days, that love has a new name to follow, Rafiki Said. He's a winger, young and quick, and he's been playing his football in Belgium for Standard Liège. Now he's made a move to England, to Wolverhampton Wanderers, a club in the West Midlands with a long history and lately a habit of looking beyond the obvious places for talent. Said arrives alongside other new faces, Kieran Trippier, Raúl Jiménez, but his signing carries something a little different. For Comoros, a nation that rarely sees one of its own reach this level. It's the kind of story that gets passed around. Someone's son, someone's neighbor, wearing the gold and black shirt in one of the world's most watched leagues. The details of the transfer are modest in the telling. A short headline, a confirmed deal, a new chapter beginning. But behind it is a young man who grew up where the Indian Ocean meets volcanic rock, where the air smells of wee lang-a-lang and vanilla, and where football has always been played on rough ground with great seriousness. Wherever his career goes from here, he's already carried something of those islands with him into a much wider night. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, an Ebola outbreak has been quietly widening its reach. More than 1,800 people have been sickened, and the virus has now spread into a fourth province. Health workers have been fighting this for months, but the response has not kept pace with the disease's movement. The World Health Organization has warned that much of the spread is happening undetected, in communities where access is difficult and trust is fragile. A U.S. citizen working in the country has also tested positive, a reminder that this outbreak does not respect borders or nationality. The UN's relief chief has called on the world to move faster, saying the international response has fallen short of what the moment requires. What makes this especially hard is the landscape itself. Eastern Congo is a place of dense forest, displaced communities, and years of unrest. Vaccination teams and contact tracers do their work in conditions that would test anyone's endurance. Families are being asked to isolate, to trust strangers in protective suits, to bury their loved ones in ways that go against deep custom. Each case is a person, each number is someone's parent, child, neighbor. And behind the figures, there are health workers who show up each day knowing the risk. If you're still with me, hold that for a moment. The world's attention drifts quickly, but this outbreak is still growing, and the people living through it are still here, still waiting for the help that was promised. Senegal, these days, is wrestling with a question that doesn't make for loud headlines, but sits heavy in the rooms where policy gets made. The question is simple to ask and hard to answer. Who will restructure the debt? The details aren't fully public yet, but the framing alone tells you something. When a country starts asking openly who will handle its debt restructuring, it means the conversation has moved past whether something needs to be done and into the harder territory of how, and by whom. Debt restructuring is never just a financial maneuver. It touches everything a government can afford: schools, clinics, roads, the quiet machinery of daily life. And in Senegal, where the economy has been growing steadily, but where the weight of borrowing has been building, the question of who takes responsibility for reshaping that debt is as much political as it is economic. It involves negotiations with lenders, decisions about priorities, and a careful balancing act between what the country owes and what its people need. There's no crisis announced here, no alarm sounded, but there's a seriousness to the question that deserves attention. It's the kind of story that unfolds slowly, in meetings and memos and quiet corridors, far from the cameras. And for the people of Senegal, the answer will eventually shape something real, not in a single dramatic moment, but in the steady accumulation of choices that determine what a nation can build next. If you're still with me, hold that thought gently. It's a story still finding its shape. Sweden has been making its voice heard in Brussels, and the message is a simple one. Don't walk back the environmental rules Europe already committed to. The details of the debate are still unfolding, but Sweden's position is clear. The green regulations that have been put in place over recent years are not something to be quietly dismantled. They see them as commitments, not just policies, for a country that has long treated its forests, rivers, and clean air as part of its identity. This isn't abstract. It's the kind of thing that sits close to how Swedes understand their place in the world. The EU has been under pressure from various directions to ease some of its environmental requirements, with industry voices and member states weighing in on costs and timelines. Sweden isn't pretending those pressures don't exist, but they're arguing that the answer isn't to retreat from what was agreed. It's to find ways to meet those goals without losing the ground already gained. It's a quiet kind of insistence, Not dramatic, not loud, but firm. The sort of stance that doesn't make for shouting headlines, but does tend to matter in the long run, in those rooms where the actual rules get shaped. And if you're still with me, you might recognize the pattern. A small country speaking plainly to a larger body, asking it to keep its word. Whether the EU listens remains to be seen, but Sweden has said its piece, and they're not likely to stop saying it. Jordan, the country, shares its name with a river that has carried meaning for millennia. But this week, that name also belongs to a young man on a rugby field, far away in New Zealand. Will Jordan wears the famous black jersey of the All Blacks, and in a nations championship match against Italy, he did something that hadn't been done before. He crossed the try line enough times to claim a try-scoring record, the kind of mark that quietly accumulates over a career until one day you look up and realize you've passed everyone who came before you. Rugby, of course, is New Zealand's game, not Jordan's. Football is the passion here, and the kingdom has its own sporting stories, its own quiet triumphs on smaller stages. But names travel, they cross borders and oceans and end up in places you wouldn't expect. A player called Jordan, playing for a team that wears black, setting a record against a team in blue on a green field somewhere far from the deserts and hills of the Levant. Sometimes the world is like that, connected by threads you only notice when the light catches them a certain way. And if you're still with me, that's the small, odd, pleasing thing from tonight. A name shared and a record made. Hungary has waited a long time for this particular piece of news. The European Union has cleared the country's recovery plan, unlocking around 10 billion euros in funding that had been held back during years of disagreement between Budapest and Brussels. For ordinary Hungarians, the money is not abstract. It is meant for things like energy efficiency, railway upgrades, and the slow, patient work of modernizing public services, the kind of improvements that show up not in headlines but in quieter ways, in warmer homes and smoother journeys. The path to this clearing was not simple. Hungary and the EU clashed over rule of law concerns, over judicial independence, over how public money should be tracked. For a while, the funds sat just out of reach, promised but paused. Now the green light has come, and with it a kind of exhale. There are still conditions attached, and there will be watching from both sides, Brussels wanting proof the money is well spent, Budapest wanting to show it can deliver. But the agreement itself marks a turning of a page, however cautiously. If you're still with me, think of it as a bridge being lowered between two banks that had stood apart for some time. The crossing is possible now. What travels across it, and how far it goes, is a story still being written. For tonight, though, Hungary has something it has been waiting for, and sometimes that is enough to rest on. Qatar has stepped quietly into one of the most consequential conversations happening in the Gulf these days, the effort to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. The strait is a narrow stretch of water between Iran and Oman, and if you've never seen it on a map, it's worth picturing. It's the throat of the Persian Gulf, and a staggering share of the world's oil and gas passes through it. When that passage is uncertain, the whole world feels it. Now Qatar has joined talks already underway between Iran and Oman aimed at reopening the route and keeping it open. It's the kind of diplomacy that doesn't make a lot of noise. No summits, no cameras, no sweeping declarations. Just a small Gulf state sitting at the table with two neighbors, working on something that matters to everyone who depends on the sea lanes, which, in one way or another, is most of us. Qatar has played this role before. It's a country that tends to keep lines open when others have closed theirs, and it carries a particular kind of weight in the region. Not from size, but from relationships, from patience, from the habit of showing up. Whether these talks succeed in the coming weeks is something nobody can say yet. But the fact that they're happening at all, And that Qatar wanted to be part of them tells you something about how the Gulf works at its best. Quiet conversations, held close to the water, with the understanding that some passages are too important to leave unattended. In Zimbabwe, there is a quiet kind of dynasty building, and it doesn't belong to people. It belongs to black rhinos. For decades, these animals were pushed to the edge. Poaching across southern Africa took a devastating toll, and Zimbabwe's black rhinos were among the hardest hit. Whole populations vanished from areas where they'd once been common. But conservation groups, including Save the Rhino International, have been working with local rangers and wildlife authorities to turn that around. And these days, there are signs it's working. Black rhino numbers in Zimbabwe have been climbing, slowly and carefully, the way recovery from something so close to loss always moves. The work is unglamorous. It means tracking animals across thick bush, guarding them day and night, building community support so that people living near rhinos see them as worth protecting. It means patience across generations, because rhinos don't multiply quickly. A calf takes years to raise, and a population takes decades to truly come back. But it is coming back. There are places in Zimbabwe now where black rhinos are breeding again, where young calves are walking behind their mothers through scrubland they might not have known a decade ago. The people doing this work don't talk about it as a victory. They talk about it as a duty, something owed to the land and to the animals that belong on it. And if you listen for it, beneath the louder news of the world, there's a small, steady sound in Zimbabwe's wild places. Hooves on earth. Cows learning the shape of their world. A dynasty rebuilt one careful generation at a time. Djibouti sits at one of the narrowest points where the African continent meets the sea, a place that has always belonged to trade routes and crossroads. These days, a committee has been meeting to discuss the expansion of the Ethio-Djibouti railway corridor, the line that links the port of Djibouti to neighboring Ethiopia and its capital, Addis Ababa. The railway itself is not new. It follows an old path, one that for generations carried goods and people between the highlands of Ethiopia and the warm waters of the Gulf of Tajora. What is being discussed now is how to widen what that corridor can do. More capacity, better logistics, a deeper connection between a landlocked nation of over 100 million people and the small but strategically placed country on the coast. If you look at a map, the logic is simple. Ethiopia needs a port. Djibouti has one. The railway between them is the thread that holds a great deal of commerce together. When the corridor hums, goods move, prices ease, and the rhythm of daily life in both countries steadies a little. The talks are technical, the kind of thing that happens in meeting rooms with charts and projections. But underneath the paperwork is something older and more human. Two neighbors figuring out how to share a road that neither can really do without. How far the expansion goes, and how soon, remains to be seen. But the conversation is happening, and the direction, for now, is forward. Armenia has been quietly recalibrating its place in the world, and one of the clearest signs is a number. Trade between Armenia and Russia has fallen by roughly 21.5% in the early part of this year. That figure, reported by the Azerbaijani outlet Caliber, tells a story that Armenians know well from living it, a country finding its footing as old relationships shift. For generations, Armenia's economy has been deeply tangled with Russia's. Remittances, energy, rail lines, markets, all of it ran north. So, a decline of this size is not just a statistic on a page, it is felt in shops and workshops, in the price of goods, in the quiet calculations families make at the end of the month. And yet, a falling number does not always mean a falling country. Armenia has been reaching outward in new directions toward Europe, toward neighbors in the region, toward its own diaspora. There are signs of that reach elsewhere in the news. Starlink donating devices to strengthen emergency connectivity, the Council of Europe noting progress on financial transparency. Each one small, each one a thread being woven into something newer. What happens with Russia will keep mattering to Armenia. That bond is deep, and it will not vanish in a single year. But these days, if you stand in Yerevan and listen carefully, you can hear something besides the old rhythms, a country testing new notes, not yet sure of the tune. Finland has been quietly reshaping how it trains its soldiers. The reason is one that much of the world has been watching unfold in recent conflicts. Drones. Small, cheap, and increasingly common on modern battlefields. They've changed what military preparedness actually means, so Finland is adapting its training to account for them. For a country that shares a long border with Russia and is now a NATO member, this isn't abstract. Finland has long taken its defense seriously. Now the question of what soldiers train for is shifting, and drones are part of the answer. It fits alongside other quiet changes. Finland has lifted its ban on nuclear arms on its territory, a move its ambassador described as maximizing deterrence. The country has also joined NATO's air-to-air refueling program, deepening the practical ties of alliance membership. And Finland is operating F-35 fighter jets, sophisticated aircraft that need to work seamlessly alongside allied systems. None of this is loud. It's the kind of change that happens in training fields and policy rooms, far from headlines. But it tells you something about how Finland sees the world these days, a country often called the happiest on earth, and also one of the most prepared. The two things, it turns out, coexist more easily than you might expect. And that's the world for tonight. Wherever you are, whatever tomorrow holds, rest easy. The world will keep turning slowly while you sleep, and we'll take another quiet trip around it tomorrow night. Good night.